August 27th, 1883, ranchers in Alice Springs, Australia, heard what sounded to them like the familiar sound of gunshots. Now, because of where they are and what they do, that's not an unfamiliar sound. It wasn't until later that it was discovered that the same sound was reported in over 50 locations, some of which were located thousands of miles apart. Some people said it sounded like gunshots. Others reported hearing what they thought was cannon fire from nearby ships. And one lady even reported hearing what she identified as an unidentified cracking sound that was overwhelming. What researchers later discovered is that what the ranchers and others heard that day were not gunshots at all. It was not cannon fire, and it was not an unidentified cracking sound. Instead, it was the eruption of a volcano on a remote Indonesian island that was located 2,233 miles away from where the ranchers were in Alice Springs, Australia. It's known as the Krakatoa Eruption, and here's what it looks like today. I've got a picture. According to the people who study this kind of thing, this is the loudest sound that's ever been measured on Earth. It measured 310 on the decibel scale, meaning that if you had been within a certain distance of the volcano as it erupted, not only would your eardrums have busted, but the sound waves most likely would have killed you. The sound waves were so strong that not only did 2/3 of the island collapse the moment of the explosion, the waves themselves traveled around the circumference of the earth 5 complete times over the next 7 days. Builders reported cracks in concrete walls that were 1 foot thick over 500 miles away from the site of the volcano. Not long ago, the New York Times did an article looking back on that particular volcanic eruption. They explained that if you were somehow able to drill a hole through the center of the earth opposite of where the Krakatoa Island was located, you would eventually wind up in Colombia, South America. And as best they can tell, the sound of the eruption was not audible in Colombia, South America when it happened, but there was a measurable spike in the atmospheric pressure that day because of something called infrasonic sound waves. In other words, the sound couldn't be heard, but it could be felt. One columnist summarized this way. She said, just because you can't hear a sound doesn't mean it's not there. If you have your Bible with you or your phone, I want you to go to John chapter 10. And today we're in week 2 of this series in which we're tackling a problem that I think all of us struggle with. And that's this whole issue of hearing and recognizing God's voice. And the problem is, if you believe in God, and I'm assuming that you do since you're here, then it only makes sense to think that if God is the creator of everything, that if God were to speak, it would be something just incredibly loud. It would be something that you couldn't miss and you couldn't ignore. It would be something similar to a volcanic eruption. And yet, if you've ever been in a situation in which you desperately needed to hear from God, then you know sometimes it doesn't feel like that. In fact, sometimes it feels as if God is silent. But just like the writer for the New York Times said, just because you can't hear a sound doesn't mean it isn't there. And as you read through the Bible, what you discover is that the voice of God, whenever He chooses to speak, rather than sounding like a volcanic eruption, often sounds like a still small voice that's easy to miss unless you're paying close attention. In John 10, what you find is a story about hearing God's voice. And just to set this up for you, in the first century in Palestine, there were 3 main occupations. You were either a fisherman, a farmer, or a shepherd. And as chapter 10 opens, Jesus is right in the middle of this ongoing confrontation between He and the Pharisees, who were the religious leaders of that time period, when He uses an illustration that everybody hearing Him could immediately relate to because this was part of their daily life. So as soon as Jesus started talking, they would have been leaning in, trying to make sense of what He was saying. If you have your Bible open, I want you to check this out with me. John chapter 10, verse 1. Very truly, I tell you, Pharisees, who does not enter the sheep pen by the gate, but anyone who does not enter the sheep pen by the gate, but climbs in by some other way, is a thief and a robber. The one who enters by the gate is the shepherd of the sheep. The gatekeeper opens the gate for him, and the sheep listen to his voice. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. When he has brought out all his own, he goes on ahead of them, and his sheep follow him because they know his voice, but they will never follow a stranger. In fact, they will run away from him because they do not recognize a stranger's voice. And Jesus used this figure of speech because the Pharisees did not understand what he was telling them. So right off the bat, Jesus identifies this problem. It was a problem in the first century. It's a problem in the 21st century. In the first century, it was the problem of this competition that was taking place between the voice of Jesus and what he was saying and the voice of the Pharisees and what they were saying. Now, fast forward 2021, and there are millions of competing voices all battling against each other for your allegiance and your attention. Every single day, there are people who wake up thinking about how they can get you to think like they think, value what they value, and buy what they're selling. And sometimes they even know more about you than you know about you. You ever had this experience? You'll be doing something, and you'll have just the faintest thought of something. And a few minutes later, you get on your phone, and what pops up? An ad for the very thing you were thinking about. Why? Because in a very real sense, they're attempting to read your mind. They've got more information on you than you've got on yourself. And they're using it against you to try and influence your thinking to do whatever it is they want you to do. That's why Jesus said one of the key things that will separate his followers in the future is that they would learn to separate his voice and identify his voice to the exclusion of all the other voices that are clamoring for their attention. And the reason it's so important that we learn to do that is because Jesus made it clear that there were people who were out to harm them. He calls them thieves and robbers. You call them a lot of other things today, but you get the point. A shepherd always had three primary responsibilities. It was the shepherd's job to protect the sheep, to guide the sheep, and to care for the sheep. And because the sheep were so dependent on the shepherd, they had a pretty intense process they would go through. During the day, the shepherd would lead his herd out to somewhere where they could graze for the day and just spend a peaceful day relaxing. But then as the sun went down, the shepherd would call the sheep, and he would put them in some sort of a cave or maybe a makeshift pen for the night. Ideally, it would be a place that had one way in and one way out. And as they were coming in one by one, the shepherd would post himself up near the entrance, and he would examine each individual sheep just to make sure they didn't need any medical care, make sure everybody was in good shape. And then once all the sheep were in, the shepherd would literally lay down across the entrance. In that sense, the shepherd was the gate, or he was the door that all the individual sheep had to pass through. And the reason the shepherd would lay down near the door is to keep the predators out, while at the same time keeping the sheep in. And that's what a gate does. A gate always serves two purposes. It keeps the wrong things out, and it keeps the right things in. But what complicated the process is that in those days, you would have all of these herds out together. You'd have shepherds from different owners out there leading the herds. And then when night rolled around, they knew there was strength in numbers, so they would combine their herds for the night. And instead of having several smaller herds, you'd have one large herd. And the shepherds would lay down near the entrance, and then the morning would roll around, and you'd have these sheep who had been mixing together all night. They'd been mingling together, and now you don't know which sheep belonged to which shepherd. It sounds complicated, but the fix was really simple. You put one shepherd over here and one here and maybe one back here, and they would sort of spread out, and they would start walking, and they would call for their sheep, and pretty soon the sheep that identified that shepherd's voice would follow that shepherd while the others would go with their shepherd, and pretty soon this one large herd was split back up into several smaller herds. And the reason that worked is because over time the shepherd would spend so much time with the sheep that the sheep would learn to automatically recognize his voice and follow his commands almost without even thinking about it. And Jesus says that's a picture of the way you and I are to hear and relate to God's voice. So when God speaks, Jesus said, hey, rather than a volcanic eruption that sends, shockwaves around the world, it often sounds like the voice of a shepherd. That's why it's so easy to miss. How do you learn to hear God's voice? Last week we talked about the idea of hearing God through Scripture. One writer said, those who hear God's voice best are the people who know His Word most. And that's true. If you want to know what God is saying in the present, the best way to do that is to immerse yourself in what He said in the past, because He'll never say anything in the present that contradicts what He said in the past. But today we want to take it a step further and talk about how you and I can learn to hear His voice like a sheep hears the voice of a shepherd. As you look at what Jesus said in John chapter 10, there are three things that He says we can all do, and they're not hard to understand, but they're sometimes hard to do, that will help us learn to recognize the voice of God. So if you're taking notes, here's the first one. To hear God's voice, I have to listen intently. As I mentioned earlier, we live in a culture of competing voices. There are marketing experts and political leaders and cultural trendsetters and movie stars and athletes and podcasters and, cable news commentators and social media influencers who are working hard, and they're spending millions of dollars all in an attempt to figure out new ways to capture your attention so that you'll do whatever it is they want you to do. They want you to increase their ratings and add to their followers and improve their poll numbers and buy their products and ultimately build their bank account. And so what happens is from the time you wake up in the morning until the time you go to sleep at night, you have all these people and all this noise that's directed at you and bearing down on you. And if you're not careful, all of that junk drowns out the one voice that we really need to hear. There's a great story in the Old Testament, the prophet Elijah. He goes up on this place called Mount Carmel. And there he gets in this altercation, this showdown with 450 prophets of the false god Baal. And somehow God comes through and Elijah wins and all those prophets are killed. And it's like this big dramatic victory. I mean, you got to think Elijah's, walking on top of the world. Then in the very next chapter, it says the queen, a lady named Jezebel, threatens his life. And what's he do? He does what a lot of us do. He goes to pieces, man. He takes off, he runs, he hides. He's worried, he's uncertain. He's literally scared to death. And that's when God shows up and He reminds Elijah of something that somehow he'd forgotten. This is from 1 Kings chapter 19. Here's the way it goes down. The Lord said, go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord. The Lord is about to pass by. Then a great and powerful wind tore the mountain apart and shattered the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake came a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire came a gentle whisper. See, Elijah made the mistake of thinking that because God had done something dramatic in the past, that's how God always operates. He made this assumption that God was going, whenever God speaks, it's going to be something you can't miss. It's going to be, hurricane force winds, and the earth is going to shake, and there's going to be flames shooting out, and it's going to be something that you couldn't ignore if you wanted to. But instead, what Elijah discovered is that when God speaks, it sounds like a whisper. I mentioned earlier the sound waves are measured in something called decibels. The Krakatoa Eruption, the loudest sound ever measured, was 310 decibels. And thankfully, the stuff we encounter in our day-to-day lives doesn't come anywhere near that. Anything over 110 decibels can get physically uncomfortable, cause your ears to hurt, causes your chest to pound, your blood pressure to increase, can even cause you to get nauseous if it's loud enough. So that's why most of the stuff that you encounter, on a normal day is anywhere between 40 and 100 on the decibel scale. So for example, if you've got an electric toothbrush, that noise it makes you put in your mouth, that's about 70 decibels. A washing machine is about 75 decibels. A car horn is usually around 100 decibels. A siren, if an ambulance goes past you on the highway, about 120 decibels. It's meant to get your attention. But here's where this gets tricky. The average person talking in a normal conversation registers somewhere around 60 decibels. Now, I know some people are louder than others, and you may live with people you think, man, I wish it was only 60. But however that works out for you, if you were to turn my microphone off, I'd be talking somewhere around 60 decibels. That's where most of us can hear pretty comfortably. That's where you can sort of get your point across. But a whisper doesn't come anywhere close to that. A whisper normally registers between 15 and 30 decibels. And that means that unless you're really paying attention, unless you're really focused, it's easy to miss a whisper because everything around you that makes noise is louder than the whisper. And if you're not careful, it'll drown it out. To hear a whisper, you've got to listen intently. You've got to lean in. One writer said it this way: God often speaks loudest when we're quietest. C.S. Lewis, who admittedly struggled with his prayer life, once commented that the demands of life sometimes come at us like wild animals. And you know what he's saying about it. You feel that. You get up in the morning, you think about all the stuff you've got to do, all the places you got to be, all the people that need something from you, and it can be a little bit overwhelming. If you're like me, sometimes you feel like you don't have time to breathe, much less time to really listen. But then Lewis talked about something he learned as he tried to live his life in obedience to God. And he said this. He said, the first job of each morning consists of simply shoving them all back in and listening to that other voice, taking that other point of view, letting that other larger, stronger, quieter life come flowing in. According to Lewis, see, it's when you start to listen for what he calls that other, that quieter voice, that you put yourself in a position to hear from God. So it starts with listening intently. And then you also have to listen humbly. Once you go back to verse 3, if you have your Bible still open, look at what Jesus said. He said, the gatekeeper opens the gate for him, and the sheep listen to his voice. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. And when he has brought out all his own, he goes on ahead of them, and the sheep follow him because they know his voice. So one of the things that's interesting here is that not only did the sheep have the ability to recognize the voice of the shepherd, they also had the willingness to follow him wherever he was trying to lead them. So the shepherd would go out and he would call his sheep, and the sheep would follow after him. And wherever he went, that's where they went. If he stopped, they stopped. If he went right, they went right. If he turned left, they turned left. It was this constant calling out and this constant response of following him. Some of you know I used to be a basketball referee. No need to boo me. I've heard all that before. But I was thinking back this week to one particular game, and it involved a coach that if I were to say his name, some of you would know who he is. Some of you who follow that from Central Kentucky, highly respected, had a very good team in this particular season, and it's near the end of the year, right before the district tournament, and they're playing one of their district rivals who admittedly on that particular year was not very good. On paper, this is one of those games that would be a complete mismatch. You've got one team, led by a highly successful coach, picked to probably win the region, maybe go to the state tournament and make some real noise there. On the other team, you've got a team with a pretty bad record, not many players. Just didn't look like it was going to go well. But you've seen games like that before, and as soon as the game started, it was immediately clear that the better team, the players on that team, had overlooked their opponent. You know how that goes. One team's playing hard, the other team's going through the motions, and by the end of the first quarter, the team that really should have been blown out is up 7 or 8 points. So the second quarter rolls around, and it's more of the same. And by the time halftime gets here, it's now a double digit. They're down double digits to a team they should be, blowing out of the gym. Now, if you're a sports fan, you've seen that happen. And normally what happens is you go into halftime, the coach goes crazy, gets everybody's attention. They come out in the third quarter, sort of do what they're supposed to do and restore order, and then they win the game, and everybody sort of forgets about the first half they played. But on this particular night, that's not what happened. Come out for the third quarter, and it was more of the same. The coach would say something, and the players would do the opposite. He'd say, speed up, and they would slow down. He'd say, stop, and they'd keep going. And finally, about halfway through the third quarter, 4 or 5 minutes left in the quarter, the coach has had enough. So I'll never forget, here's what he does. He goes over to the bench, and he sits down. And for the rest of the game, never said a word. Didn't call timeout. Didn't call any plays, didn't encourage anybody to play defense, didn't tell anybody to rebound, didn't even talk to the referees, which I thought was awesome. I mean, here's a guy very vocal, very emotional, and he sets the quarters over, and here's the team huddled, and he goes down to the opposite of the bench, and he's down there drinking Gatorade, and all the players are looking at him, and he's not saying a word. Fourth quarter rolls around, more of the same, not just not playing well. And his team winds up losing pretty bad to an inferior opponent. But he made his point. If you're not going to listen, I'm not going to talk. And you think maybe that the reason God doesn't speak to some of us is because he already knows that we're not going to listen? You think about your experience with God. How many times in your past has God said to go and you chose to stay? Or how many times has God said to stop and you chose to go? Or how many times has God said, hey, I want you to do this, and you chose to do the opposite? How many times have you truly listened to what God told you to do and then followed through it? See, one of the things you see as you read through the Bible, there seems to be this direct correlation that God speaks most to the people who listen best. So one of the reasons God spoke to Abraham is because when he told Abraham to go, Abraham went. And the reason he spoke to Noah is because when he told Noah to build an ark, Noah built an ark. And the reason he spoke to Paul and said, I want you to go here and do this, and then when you're done with that, I want you to go over here and do this, is because wherever he told Paul to go and whatever he told Paul to do, that's what Paul did. There seems to be this direct correlation. And so that means if I want to be a person that hears from God on a regular basis, that means I have to humble myself enough to listen to whatever he says and then to do whatever he tells me to do. So I listen intently. I listen humbly. One more thing, I have to listen consistently. You get to the end of verse 6, it says the Pharisees somehow missed the point of what Jesus was saying. So in verse 7, Jesus jumps back in and he tries to make explicit what's been implicit up until this point. Listen to what he says. Therefore Jesus said again, very truly I tell you, I am the gate for the sheep. And all who have come before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep have not listened to them. I am the gate. Whoever enters through me will be saved. They will come in and go out and find pasture. The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. So again, Jesus says, hey, I'm the gate. Nobody comes to the Father. Nobody has a relationship with the Father unless they first have a relationship with me. But the other thing he makes clear here is that if you're one of his followers, you need to understand you have an enemy. Make sure you know, just like there are people who spend all day, every day trying to figure out a way to sell you something, you have an enemy who works overtime trying to figure out a way to destroy you. He wants to ruin your relationship, steal your health, drain your bank account, ruin your career, break apart your family. He wants to do whatever he can to destroy you and to kill you. And here's the scary part. If you look at verse 10 where it says the thief comes. In Greek, that's written in the present tense. So here's what that means. Another way to read this would be the thief comes and he keeps on coming. And he keeps on coming. And he keeps on coming. And he keeps on coming only to steal and kill and destroy. See, his coming is not a one-time event. It's an everyday event. If he doesn't get you today, he's going to come back after you tomorrow. And if he doesn't get you tomorrow, he's going to be there the next day. And a week from today, he's going to be there. That's just how he operates. That's the bad news. But here's the good news. If you look at the second part of verse 10, Jesus made it clear that even though you have an enemy, you also have a protector. If you're a follower of Jesus, you have a shepherd who has your best interest at heart. And rather than seeing you destroyed, he wants to see you become the best possible version of who you were created to be. And to make it even better, not only does he want that for you, he promises to help you experience that if you'll just listen to what he says. And the result of all that will be what Jesus calls an abundant life. The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I have come that they, talking about me and you, may have life and have it to the full. Your translation might say that they may have life and have it abundantly. Rather than having a ruined life, you can have an abundant life. Rather than having a life littered with broken relationships, you can have a life defined by deep and meaningful relationships. Rather than spending your life, going around in circles, aimless and purposelessness, Jesus says you can have a life of purpose in which you make a difference to the people around you. And rather than living a life that's unhealthy in innumerable ways, Jesus says you can have a life that's defined by love and joy and peace and patience and kindness. But it all comes down to whether or not you're willing to listen intently, listen humbly, and listen consistently. I've got a picture I want to show you. I was thinking about the Krakatoa Eruption this past week, and in my mind I went back to a familiar story. Some of you have heard this, about the guy you see on the screen. His name is Harry R. Truman, not to be confused with Harry S. Truman, Harry R. Truman. And for 57 years, he and his wife Edith ran a lodge. We would call it a resort. They called it a fishing camp, a little nicer than what comes to mind when you hear that, called Spirit Lake Lodge, located just 1 mile away from the base of Mount St. Helens in southwestern Washington. His wife Edith died in 1978. But because he loved the area so much and loved what he did, he tried his best to keep the lodge going. That is until a couple years later, March of 1980, when all of a sudden, Mount St. Helens, this volcano that sat dormant for 140 years, started to show signs that something was about to happen. It started with a series of small but frequent earthquakes. They weren't too big, but there was a lot of them in a short amount of time, and everybody started paying attention. And then one day they woke up, and all of a sudden, man, out of nowhere, there was all this steam that was coming out of the top of the mountain. And at that point, the government officials, they weren't sure what was happening, but they were certain that something was happening. So they ordered a mandatory evacuation in and around St. Helens. All the while, the pressure inside the mountain just continued to build. Harry R. Truman, the man you see on the screen, though, refused to leave. And it wasn't long until the media picked up his story, and for several days straight, they traveled to his lodge and they asked him why he was refusing to leave. And over again, he would give some colorful quote. For example, he told the reporter from the New York Times, he said, "They'll never get me off this mountain. Spirit Lake and Mount St. Helens are a part of me. They're mine. They're as much a part of me as my arms and my legs. I know that mountain like the back of my hand, and that mountain will never hurt me." And some of you may actually remember this. It went on like this for a couple months. The government officials would come and they would beg him to leave, and he'd say no, and somebody from the media would come and interview him, and he'd give some crazy quote, and then nothing would change. And during that time, he became sort of like a national curiosity. Every night, the lead story in the news was, what about Harry R. Truman, and what did he say today? That is until May 18th, 1980, at 8:32 in the morning, when all of a sudden Mount St. Helens erupted. The sound measured at 163 decibels, and the force of the explosion was so great that it broke out windows 250 miles away in the city of Seattle. 45 miles away from the volcano, the water in those mountain streams got so hot that the fish were literally jumping out of the water, jumping onto the bank to try and keep from being boiled. The eruption itself lasted just over 9 hours. But the scientists tell us that within just about 3 to 4 seconds of the initial explosion, Harry R. Truman's body was vaporized. Not one trace of him left. Do you know what's worse than not hearing the voice of God? It's hearing his voice and choosing to ignore it. So I don't know about you, as I think back over my life, my biggest problem has never been impaired hearing. It's been selective hearing. And I'm pretty good at ignoring what God tells me sometimes. And I bet you are too. But if I want to be a person that that God speaks to, if I want to be a person that recognizes his voice, and if I want to be the best possible version of who I was created to be, it starts with learning to listen and follow his voice. Jesus said it like this in John 10:27. He said, my sheep listen to my voice. I know them and they follow me. I want you to stand. If you're here this morning and you've not been following him, today would be a great day to change direction. We had a man last week after the second service changed direction in his life. He prayed with us. He repented of his sin. He confessed Christ, was baptized into Christ, and now not only is his future secured, his present is transformed, and that can be the same for you. So if you're here and you've not been following him and you need help figuring out how to do that, Dave and I would love to talk to you. Just come meet us up here on one of these front rows. Or maybe for you, it's not the first step that you need to take. It's the next step, whatever that is for you. We'd be honored to help you figure that out. Or maybe you don't need our help. Maybe you just need to pray and ask God to speak and promise him that if he speaks, that you'll listen. Would you sing with us?